And I think the answer is in a Climate Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Like, I'm really excited by the idea of doing what they did in South Africa. Even if South Africa is not perfect now and it's still a mess, there's still an ideology that people are working towards, right? And we don't have that in the climate.
This is Climate Curious, the podcast for people who are bored, scared, or confused by climate change.
I'm Mariam Pasha, the director and curator at TEDx London and the co-host of this podcast, alongside the amazing Ben.
Hi, I'm Ben Hurst, activist and advocate exploring what positive masculinities can look like, and self-confessed climate normie.
So we're at New York Climate Week. We are spending our incredible Saturday with you, Paul, and your incredible team and organization. Tell us who you are and where we are.
Right, I'm Paul Redman, executive director and founder of If Not Us Then Who.
Even the name of your organization is quite telling.
Yeah.
If not us, then who?
Yeah.
Say more.
Yeah, I mean, for me, If Not Us Then Who, I mean, I was naive when I started the organization, If Not Us Then Who. I'm like, okay, if not us, then who? We can all claim indigenous, ways of being and connect with what it is to be an environmental activist. And then as soon as I came in with that, with the meeting with a few indigenous leaders, they're like, hang on a second.
They're like, if not you, then us. Yeah.
What about us? Yeah. And I'm like, good point. And so like, we need direct finance, we need territorial governance, we need to stop being criminalized and murdered. We need our ancestral wisdom in climate decision making. Like, all of the messages came across. I'm like, okay, I hear you. Let's spend 10 years doing this, right? And so I think, If Not Us Then Who really is a way to empower indigenous creators and indigenous peoples. But I think beyond that, it's really like a call to action for environmentalists, right? And it's centered around indigenous wisdom, which is, about belonging. It's about community, and it's about sort of looking after your neighbors and your friends and your family and being close. And so If Not Us Then Who is like a sprawling collective of, passionate storytellers, passionate creatives. We have an indigenous-led board. We're half indigenous, half non-indigenous. And so we're sort of a group of people that play with messaging and really try and inspire leaders, and inspire people outside of the leadership to really be better, in their climate activism.
What does that look like on a day to day? I'm struggling to conceptualize. What?
It is
broad. It sounds cool.
Yeah. No, I feel like I start with a blank piece of paper every year. So I'll give you a different answer next year.
Those few days, the same. I get that.
No, the joy of communication is you flow with stuff, right? And you respond to what feels right? But I mean, I think day to day, like, we have a lot of training programs where we equip, commission, train filmmakers, storytellers, social media influencers, indigenous focused, local community focused, to just be better at telling shorter stories. And then the other aspect is like, okay, we've got a lot of short stories being told, like, how do we have an impact with those?
Right.
And so the impact space is what we're in now, right? We have this Our Village pop-up space, which is at climate conferences. So these spaces, we get all the NGOs, we get indigenous leaders, we get donors into the same space so we can build networks and build partnerships. And so the media we produce in our training programs come into here. But not just the media, right? It's the people who make the media, the indigenous leaders who are featured in the media, people who support that. And so we just try to kind of collectivize the movement, right? Get people to know what each other are doing and get out of that, NGO, I'm doing this, I'm doing that. Logo obsession, right? How do we break down the barriers and get people to work more effectively together?
Right. And this space has felt today very different to all of the other spaces that I've been in Climate Week or Climate Weeks past. And there's something about it that maybe I can't put my finger on. Do you know what it is? Is it intentional or is it accidental? Is it like?
Yeah, I mean, it's intentional. I mean, we need to diversify the climate messengers, the climate narrative. And so what we do here is just bring, Black environmental leadership, indigenous environmental leadership, local community leadership, good white allies, everybody and anybody who really is listening to each other and who is on the lines that we're excited by, which is we need biodiversity. We need lots of people talking climate messages.
Right.
Too often it's the same people from the same moneyed backgrounds telling us the same solutions. And that stuff's not going to work. We know that, right?
Yeah, it literally hasn't worked. It hasn't worked already, guys. I don't know if you're paying attention, but it's not working. Yeah.
No, but I mean, the thing is, like, you people are talking about climate solutions and what's the new tech result.
Yeah.
But they're trying to put these seeds on infertile ground,
right?
We have a lot of distrust. We have, a lot of people not engaged in the process. And so what we're trying to create here is like people to feel part of a movement together. People feel like some of the wounds are healed, some of the barriers are broken down between each other, right? I think that's an important space.
And it felt slower. I don't know if that's accurate, but it's felt like there's been space for ritual and tradition. And also I felt the discomfort of like having to listen to people speak in a language that I don't understand and wait for translation, which is, I think, things that you just don't necessarily think about. When you think about creating spaces that are inclusive to everybody, in my mind, inclusion still works like, well, everybody will just conform to what I do or how I like to do things, rather than like actually creating spaces where the playing field is level. So maybe that's the thing that feels like very, very different to me. But I've enjoyed it. I quite like it. I think it's important.
Yeah, I think for us, like, language is the thing that we think is important. We play with, right? So that Spanish speaking, Portuguese, French, English, indigenous languages, as much as possible, we try to get those languages represented in the space so people can hear in their own language, can speak in their own language. And that's a huge breaker of barriers, but it's also music, where it's art, right? And it's like, stuff that exists outside of the things we say.
I have so many thoughts as well. I have to say, I'm just going to go back for a second and just explain to people listening that, this morning we started with a cacao ceremony, which is not something I've ever been a part of. It was really emotional. There's this moment towards the end of the ceremony where you get down on the ground. And I was thinking, when was the last time that I was like, on the ground in New York. And this was the other thing, the contrast of having been, in rooms with ultra high net worth people this week, in some of the most beautiful museums this week, having been in offices, having been trying to get through traffic, having done the subway and the heat and the rain and then all of a sudden you come in here and it's like this entirely different, it's like you've stepped into a pocket universe.
Yeah.
And to be doing this ceremony, like, you've been let in on something that is so sacred and old. Earlier this week, I got to work with some of the speakers you had here. And every time I do this, I went home and I cried for a while. And my partner was like, what is going on? And I was like, every time I have to think about what land am I connected to, I realize I have none.
Yeah.
And so then to be here and to be able to be on the ground, and even if you're in a room in the center in New York, it just felt like something very important to be a part of.
That resonates a lot. I think what is super important for us to understand in the climate movement is belonging. Like, it's a simple word, but to really feel it. Like, we're all nomads. We all move around the place. And like, for me, I also the same. I don't really have a fixed abode, right? I'm an Englishman born in South Africa, moved to England. Now I live in the US. And like, the struggle for me is, how do I belong? As a kid, I thought I was a white South African, but then I realized apartheid was happening, right? And so I don't want to be a white South African.
Yeah.
And so like, I want to like, how do I fucking belong? That's not me.
Yeah.
Yes.
What am I? And I think we all exist in that space, and these kind of ceremonies and, and these sort of connective spaces really just allow people to feel each other in a human way, to connect in a human way. And
also to hold contradiction in a way that I very rarely seen done so well. Like, I remember one of the people I got to work with, she is from an indigenous community from Panama, but she had to fight to be able to go to university to become the first lawyer in her community, and had to deal with the sexism of that. And so you've got the internal oppression, the external oppression, but the belonging and the pride and all of these seemingly contradictory forces. And she just held them, obviously with effort and patience and loads of like time and thinking. But I thought, we don't normally meet people who are able to hold those kinds of contradictions so elegantly.
Yeah, that's true.
The other thing I was going to say is about the language. The language has also really struck me.
Yeah.
It's disorienting, isn't it? It's like, I don't know if that's the right word, because I feel like it has a negative connotation, but it's just like destabilizing in a way that's very unusual.
For me, it's like, it slows me down. I think about, and I'm a communicator, right? Like, I'm a storyteller, and I had to do some coaching work this week in 3 languages.
Right.
And
That was easy, right?
And to the credit of the translators and everyone else seemed fine. I was like a fish out of water.
Right.
But it really slows you down. You have to be intentional about the sentences you say and the structures and also the phrasing so that the translation works. It's really a different world.
Yeah, I mean, it totally is. And I think that's some of the stuff that, we've been trying to heal that break of how we talk to each other. Like, with the films we have online, everything we do in all the different languages. And so we're trying to share stories of an indigenous community in Brazil with an indigenous community in Indonesia, inspire each other with their stories and not be disconnected or put off by the language.
Yeah.
And so I think it's a really important thing to do, especially when we're talking about, climate change, which affects everybody, right? I mean, and we can't just talk about it in English.
Exactly. And I think that's something that I've seen you guys do really well as well is it's global.
Yeah.
We're looking at not just indigenous people or local communities from one part of the world, but truly looking at the things, both appreciating the things that make them unique and different and are very special to who they are and where they're from, and also the things that tie them together to be part of this movement, to be a force to reckon with. We hear about COP, we hear about the massive delegations from the fossil fuel companies, the massive delegations from the big, globalized country, like westernized, industrialized countries. And then if we are separated, we don't have that same power, I think.
I think, as I was on one of the slides this morning, individualism or the push for the individual is the thing that's destroying our world, right? And so if we can work on collectivism, then that's the way forward, right? That's the opposite to what the racism, the sort of madness that being this industrial age. And so we're sort of need to try and, where possible, to see common humanity, right? And that happens in language, but also it happens in good story, as you know, right?
Yeah.
And I'm a big fan of video in that space, because video for me is the image, but also the sound, the tone in the voice, which, you hear somebody's passion, you hear somebody's grief, right? And so, I think it's important that we kind of tease those out and recognize and listen and see those things in each other. Because that collectivism is what's going to get us out of this climate madness.
Which is like, how did you find yourself here? How do you find yourself in this work? Because if we were walking down the street outside, I don't think if I walked past you, I would assume that you'd be somebody who would care about any of this stuff. Yeah. You don't look like somebody who would care about
despite the great shirt.
Right. Yeah, maybe the shirt is a little bit of a giveaway. The shirt is a little bit of a giveaway. But there are even just mixing downstairs, right? There are people who are walking past in traditional dress. There are people who are walking past with face markings, traditional, all types of traditional regalia, all of those kinds of things. How have you managed to find yourself in what seems to be the center of all of these indigenous communities as a white man?
Yeah, I would argue I'm not in the center of it, right?
Right, yeah. When I said in the center, I was like, that's the wrong phrase, but I'm glad that you picked someone here.
No, but I get it. I mean, and I think for me, it's been a journey, right? I can't say, how did I get here? I basically got here because, like I said, I grew up in South Africa, and when I left South Africa as a 13-year-old, I kind of came to England. I was like, you're racist because you're a white South African, the height of the anti-apartheid movement. At that point, I was like, shit, what did I miss in my upbringing? It's like my childhood is a smokescreen. Nobody told me about these things. My family went political. And so from that moment, I was like, well, how do I get rid of this guilt and shame that I feel about being a white South African? And, and I thought, well, I'm going to pick up a camera. And because a camera gives you an excuse to explore behind the scenes and kind of try and see the world from a different perspective, right? And so I guess where I am now is just I'm at a point in my journey of kind of accepting that, I can, with the stories that I've told over my lifetime, I can create space for others. And I can see how those stories can really make people feel empowered about themselves, believe in themselves, kind of see themselves as heroes in the struggle. And so I've just been kind of being in service for a long time. And I guess for me, now I come to realize that, okay, what is my voice? I'm only coming to that at 46, right? Where I'm like, okay, service. How can I help people be empowered in this space? And it's only really now where I'm like, okay, well, what do you got to say, white guy in this space, right?
Yeah, right.
And I'm still exploring that. I don't have the answer to it, right? And so I've just got, I guess, used is a terrible word, but I've kind of used my inner struggle to get to this space. And it's really from a place of healing rather than anything else.
You mentioned this idea of being a filmmaker. I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about some of the stories you've told or you've been helped bring into the world.
I was going back to, I guess, when I was doing investigative camera work. And
we're very interested in this.
And you were a spy?
Well, I was working for an organization that was using hidden cameras to expose trade in endangered species. And so...
Which is dangerous.
Expose trade in endangered species,
yeah.
And that's dangerous work.
Right? Yeah, those people will shoot you, right?
It can be dangerous, yeah. It can be dangerous.
Oh my gosh.
I mean...
Like poachers and stuff.
Yeah, poachers. So we did like the trade in tiger skins. We did the trade in ivory. We were looking at whales and dolphins.
Yeah.
We're looking at illegal logging, ozone depleting substances, and quite often, I mean, I was the camera guy, and then, I would go along with the investigator who would pretend to be a buyer. And so they'd go in, to a...
They were like, why has this guy got a camera?
Yeah, no, but I mean, in those days, people weren't suspicious of cameras.
Right.
And we had stuff hidden in handbags and hidden... There used to be at the beginning, you'd hide it in a camera bag. So you'd have like an actual camera bag with a pinhole camera on the front. Nobody would suspect that, right? Which today everybody would laugh
wow.
at it.
People would be like, that's a camera bag.
People might not even know what a camera bag is anymore, so you might be back.
Bags for your camera.
Just use your phone. Yeah.
Why is your camera so big?
But I mean, I think through that process, you learn about the power of story, right? And so like the thing that kind of comes to mind for me is in 2005, we did an investigation in the Tibetan plateau where we looked at tiger skins that were being worn by the traditional Tibetans on the plateau itself. And nobody had documented this or seen this, but they were seeing in India that tigers were going at a rate of knots, right? Like, where are they going? And so we went to Tibet and filmed these horse festivals where the local Tibetans were buying tiger skins and wearing these tiger skins. And so we documented that for the first time. And it was on scale. We were on BBC News and all that sort of stuff. I think it was amazing footage. And then with that, those images really, which were very powerful, all we did, and it was a simple process through this lady Belinda Wright, who works in India, who knew the Dalai Lama. She gave him this footage, and he said, if you love me, burn those tiger skins across the Tibetan plateau. The next year they burnt skins across the plateau, and we went back the year later, and there was like hardly any skins being worn. The skins that were being worn were by the Chinese officials or the people that wanted to be close to the Chinese officials.
Wow.
And so it's like those sorts of things are really like just incredible to see how such a small piece of video or a small piece of stills can really transform things. And there's so many examples of that, in that investigative work.
So you just ran an influencer campaign with the Dalai Lama.
As you call it nowadays. Yeah, we ran an influencer campaign.
Like, bro, just tell them you don't like it. And they were like, yeah, no, we don't like this anymore. It's out. We're done.
No, but and I think cutting forward to today, I mean, we've done some really interesting things where where we filmed Indigenous leaders, and the idea behind If Not Us and Who is to take the perception of Indigenous peoples as being victims of climate catastrophe into being heroes in the battle to mitigate against climate change.
Right.
And so, that doesn't mean we just tell positive stories. Every story has two ways of saying it, right? You have a negative view and you can have a positive view of it. And there's middle ground as well. But mostly those are the two sort of bipolar sides of a story, right? And so what we're trying to do is say, yes, like Diana Rios in 2014, I filmed her, which Diana Rios is a young Ashaninka leader whose parents were murdered by illegal loggers. And so I flew to Peru ahead of the Peruvian Climate Summit, and we filmed her in a safe house, like a month after, four of their leaders were murdered. And filmed this film, which is on our website, called Our Fight, which they named, and it's important to say when we make films as part of this process, it's participatory, right? So we speak to Indigenous leaders, identify what story they want to tell, make the story, give them final sign-off on the rough cut, and then they decide the title, they decide the calls to action. And so it's an inclusive thing. So all the media we have on our website is approved at a sort of a level. And so we documented Diana in Peru, and put that footage out, and it transformed the dialogue around the UN conference at the time, centering it around Indigenous peoples as climate solutions, right? And we've done that repeatedly at conference after conference since 2014 when we launched If Not Us Then Who. And what that's done is you've sort of seen back then, when we started in 2013, nobody was really saying Indigenous peoples come front and center in the climate conversation, right? They were outside. Nobody wanted interviews or whatever. Nowadays, in Glasgow, $1.7 billion was pledged to Indigenous peoples and local communities. What's really exciting about the work that we do a lot of, and you'll see this, with the team that we have around the space, is we train Indigenous storytellers, right? And so what that does is mean that they're making their own stories about their own heroes. And so young Indigenous peoples who might have gone, I want to get out of this village and I want to go to the town and buy some Nikes and be all involved in the city.
And those Nikes.
They kind of want it. You're saying, film your community. Tell us who your amazing environmental leaders are in your community. And in that process, a young person from a community sees the heroes at home, connects with their culture, doesn't want to leave so much, identifies with indigeneity. And that's what we're seeing now, is amazing young leaders who are like, I'm Indigenous and I am doing something. Yeah, this is who I am. Deal with it. And like that change has been really, really beautiful to see.
Yeah.
I think this idea of imagining leadership rather than victimhood, not just the fact that we're not victims, we're survivors, but actually going a step further and talking about leadership. I remember listening to a speaker from NDN Collective talk about how for a long time we bring in Indigenous and local community voices to provide like the spiritual niceness, the color, the connection to the earth, not the engineers, the architects, the policymakers, the scientists, right? And that really struck me because I'm part of the problem. I'm learning. And I was like, okay, yeah, I have to say that I engaged in that thinking. It's only once, not only is it pointed out, but then there are these stories and examples and ways that challenge yourself. And I agree, filmmaking is immersive, right? It allows you to have an experience without having to have the experience. So your mind is changed. For me, I have to say the thing that I've heard today that I cannot stop thinking about and that is really troubling me, like in an existential way. and I knew it before, but the way that it was said was from Jing on the panel that I chaired, where she said, we've borne the brunt of the problem. Like, you know, we have been the ones who are on the front lines of climate change and all of the things that have led to it, like extraction and fossil fuels and all of this. Here we are now being sacrificed again in the name of the solution, where we're mining lithium or doing hydroelectric power, or all of these things that are supposed to be the solutions to climate change are once again victimizing and ignoring the knowledge of these communities. And I was like, oh, you know, you're like, oh. And I say that only because I think there is this overarching mentality out there where it's like, we just don't have time to be sensitive to your feelings. Sorry about that.
Yeah.
And I don't know what to do about it. I'm generally bringing it here as like a thing that she said, and then I was like, please keep chairing the panel, brain. Don't get lost in this.
Don't go into crisis mode.
Yeah. But it really hit me because I think that we're on the verge of it. We're on the verge of committing the same kinds of atrocities that we sit around condemning in the name of the solution.
I mean, I've been in the same existential crisis, right? Which is like, you know, we need solutions and they need to come quickly and we need the resources to transition to electric and but it's the same, like what's left on the earth are in indigenous territories. And so they're the ones who are going to bear the brunt of a just transition, right? Don't know where the word just comes from because it's not going to be, right? And so I think, you know, the answers to that are in empowering indigenous peoples to have land ownership, which they didn't have in the past or they weren't respected, you know, and so have land ownership, respect that ownership and make sure they have free, prior, informed consent when extractivism goes in their land, right? You know, it's only by having really strong advocates for forest landscapes living in forests that those forests are protected. Like a forest on its own without people is cut. I mean, and we used to think, you know, put a fence around it, it's fine, but you can't just put a fence around it. You have to have people around that, you know, and we don't want just enforcement officers on the edge of national parks. We want people who are culturally connected, who say there's a portion of the forest we don't touch because it's spiritually important for us. Yeah. And so, I mean, it's going to be a battle, you know, and I think there's something that I think like we need to move into as well, and it kind of gets into this existential crisis part of everybody's head, right? I think, you know, and this comes from my background as well, is you know, we all carry guilt and shame from being climate destroyers, right? We're all like, even if you're in the middle of the movement, you're flying places, or maybe you're eating meat, or maybe you just can't resist those Nikes, right? Or
all of the above.
Guilty. And I think that is the emotional space that we need to move forward in the next 4 to 5 years, I would say. And so, you know, I think for me, thinking about like, what are the steps to get us collectivizing and moving forward with solutions in the right way? And I think the answer is in a Climate Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Like, I'm really excited by the idea of doing what they did in South Africa. You know, Mandela and Tutu transitioned out of apartheid with a televised video, right? Televised Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where they painted an idea of a rainbow nation.
Right.
Right. And so even if South Africa is not perfect now and it's still a mess, there's still an ideology that people are working towards, right? And we don't have that in the climate, right? We're not saying, you know, we're not offering forgiveness for the people who've messed up, and we're not allowing or seeing a path forward. Right. And I think creating a Climate Truth and Reconciliation Commission, I mean, for me is about, okay, we have that. So how do we talk then about land back, about reparations? You know, there's guilt. People have admitted to guilt and they've been forgiven, right? Yeah.
Right.
I think this emotional space, this space that we need to go in to stop this crisis thinking, to stop all of us getting apathetic and giving up.
Yeah, I think that's beautiful. Actually, is to stop us from trying to get into like proper either the fight or flight, right, or freeze. So you're like, it becomes like that. You're either just paralyzed, or you're like, no, we need to transition. We need to do it fast. Like you fight, you know, or you're just like, no, I'm done with this. I can't do this anymore. But actually, there's a much more emotional way to engage with it. And what you made me think of, we've worked a bit with Kumi Nadu in the past, and this idea of being inspired by movements around the world that maybe aren't climate movements in their explicit nature, but are things that we can learn from that have succeeded and also made errors. And like, you know, instead of trying to think we have to deal with this entirely on our own, feels a lot more doable. Yeah.
No, it does. And it just feels like, you know, in a world that's increasingly right or increasingly left, right? And both of them are to blame because they're all pointing fingers and nobody's finding a middle ground, right? We need to have the space in the middle, which is forgiveness. There's a great Hawaiian poem, which I really come back to, which is beautiful, which is, I'm sorry, please forgive me, thank you, and I love you. Like, working through that allows you to forgive and forget and to move on, you know? And I think, you know, Desmond Tutu said it best himself. He said, no future without forgiveness. You know, we're forgetting that in the climate space. We're pointing fingers. And I think that's not a way forward.
It's pretty revolutionary. I mean, I find it challenging, again, to conceptualize what it is you're talking about, because I think really interesting, my whole framing of the climate crisis and the movement towards resolving that has been one of like heroes defeating villains rather than people reconciling and creating a new future, which is challenging. I think like I imagine maybe 3 episodes from now I'll bring it back up and like start to process it in real time. But that's like it seems like a massive idea. Is it an idea that you think is just an idea, or is it something that you really believe is possible?
I think it's the only thing that's in my mind with like working this long in the movement. I'm like, I keep trying to ignore it because I know it's a big thing, right? But I'm like, it's the only thing that seems to be able to transition us out of this space, right? It's like what got people out of racial separation and apartheid? It was forgiveness, right? What's going to get people out of this space where we've screwed up, industrialized, destroyed our planet? And there are people to blame for that. Are we going to keep pointing the finger and blaming? Are we going to, that's going to take us down the rabbit hole again. You know, with those people who you blame will just be, you know, I'm the bad guy. I'm going to keep being the bad guy.
Right.
So you need to find a way to, I mean, I'm not saying just forgive. I'm saying hear the stories of like, you know, an Indigenous person was murdered and this oil executive was culpable or this dam builder was culpable. But hear the story and then the oil executive can say, I am sorry. Like,
just that taking of accountability, right? Because I guess, if I'm hearing this, part of it is to say that you can only be forgiven if you take accountability.
Exactly. Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
So, and we're not taking accountability. Those oil executives, they're not. They're saying nothing to do with me. That's not me. That's that other person. That's whatever it might be. Yeah. And so actually, forgiveness is like step 2.
Yeah.
Right? It's not just about this blanket forgiveness of like, sorry that you murdered us.
Yeah.
Or we forgive you for murdering us. It's the first step, which is the accountability. And that seems revolutionary.
Yeah. We are just dividing ourselves now, right? Along climate line. And so, but we all have an intrinsic desire to be community, right? And we're not giving ourselves permission to do that by storing anger. You know, and I see a lot of climate communication on the left. I mean, I was part of it. It was anger. This is destroyed. We're screwed. These are the people who are culpable.
Right.
Like, and it's you know, and you can understand why those messages are made. But, you know, I think deep down what burns in us is a desire for community and
belonging, like we said earlier.
Yeah.
Earlier this week, we got to speak to John Marshall from Potential Energy, and they've done this global, like 66,000 people. I don't even know how many people they've been surveying, like old school advertising methods, you know, and they were like the most effective message across the board, like across every country, every generation, every demographic, every political leaning is love.
Wow.
And you're like, what? I remember we were like,
no, it's not.
We're like, it's got to be more complicated than that.
Yeah.
And he's like, no, it's love. Hands down.
Yeah.
And you know, when you just take this moment and you think, oh, it's actually very simple.
Yeah.
It's, you know, we've been twisting ourselves in knots. Of course, the how and the what, but actually the underlying idea is very simple. And that, I think, is like maybe where we're getting to.
I think we hold on to anger too much. That blinds you to everything. And the only way to transform anger is through love, you know, accepting what was, forgiving what was, you know, and I think, like coming at the climate movement with love, with so much anger, is revolutionary in some ways, right?
So I want to ask you, you know, we are in this kind of quote unquote overly used run up to COP, which means that the council, the Congress of Parties, what does it even stand for?
The UNFCCC?
Conference of Parties, Conference of Parties, the big climate conference, right? Happening in the Middle East.
Yes.
I'm tempted to be like, tell me how all the ways you're skeptical about it, but let's put that aside.
That would be an easy thing to come to.
That would be an easy thing to come to. I want to know what stories you want to be telling in the lead up to it. Like what stories you and your team are telling or helping enable. What do you think we need to be talking about?
Undercover. Expose.
No, I mean, we drum home the same messages, I think, time and time again, you know, and it's really getting more and more specific about what's happening on the ground in Indigenous communities and how are they protecting, restoring, keeping, you know, natural spaces, you know, as part of their culture, as part of their spirituality, but, you know, forest standing, landscapes in, you know, the natural, wild way, you know, and I think, like, that's going to be repeated time and time again. I think, you know, I mean, I think some of the key messages going into COP will be, you know, direct finance for Indigenous peoples, which is something we drum home all the time. And what's needed really is like emergency finance, because there's a rise in criminalization, a rise of murder, you know, of environmental defenders. And, you know, the organizations that work nationally need funds to react quickly to like medical people out, to support family members, to do those sorts of things. And I think, you know, I'm suspicious of these COP spaces. I think they're the choice of Egypt last year, the choice of UAE this year. It's a continued restriction of civil society space when it's needed most. Right. And so, and those spaces themselves are soulless, right? They're exhibition centers in the middle of nowhere, popped up like that for a couple of weeks.
Using migrant labor.
In places that live off migrant labor. It's like colonial structures being used to create a conversation around how we dismantle colonial structures. It doesn't make any sense.
What I wanted to ask you, that look was actually more that, will you just give us like 2 sentences if someone's never heard the term direct finance, or what is that?
Direct finance is money that's going to climate solutions, going directly into the hands of Indigenous peoples living in territory.
Right. Because a lot of the money that's pledged or given through philanthropy or through these international mechanisms, it gets stuck, right? It gets stuck in the global north. It gets then stuck in the capital cities. It doesn't go to the ground. And there's so much around that that's about trust, but also about these systems that are not designed to actually get money right to the places and the decision makers.
Yeah, if I'm honest, to get stuck in intellectualizing the climate crisis, right? Trying to find a new tech, a new way to strategize about how to solve the climate, you know, and really, it's really simple.
Right.
Science proves where Indigenous land sovereignty is protected, landscapes are protected. So money needs to go straight to them. Forget strategizing about it. Forget the context. Forget making new data reports. Give the money to communities.
And now it's time for our climate confessions. Let's fess up to the bad habits we just can't kick.
So basically, long story short with this is, when we came into working in this movement and in this spaces, there was definitely a hesitation from people that felt like, oh, all these people you interview, they're perfect. You know, they've got everything right. They're doing everything right. I'm not that person, so I can't do this work. And we use this confessional to dismantle the idea of perfection. And so we'd like to ask you for your climate confession.
I feel like this whole thing has been a confession to me. It's got to be said. But I mean, for me, working in the climate space is about healing myself. I feel like I stumble through and kind of respond emotionally to the moments and just do the best I can, right? And it's not like I have some broad aim. Like, if not us and who, was a feeling that we should explore this, you know, and a way for me to explore my healing. And so, like, we're all broken coming into every space that we're in. We just, you know, our life's journey on this earth is to transform that brokenness into something that's healed. And that's not going to happen like that. Some people are blessed and feel healed at the beginning, but our life's work is to heal ourselves. And so, I don't know if that answers your question, but I think it's, you know, we're all from broken systems. We're all broken people, you know, and trying our best. And we just get up every day and try again.
I love that.
Give us an example of the brokenness. Do you use like too much toilet roll, or like what's the, what do you do? Tell me the thing. I want the confession.
Why are you broken?
I want the confession.
I mean, I don't shop in the way that I want to in relationships sometimes. And that's to do with, you know, a fear of abandonment, you know, a fear of rejection. You know, I think this work and like proving my worth helps me deal with my fear of rejection, fear of abandonment, right? I mean, we all have these core wounds that are formed between 0 and 7, let's say.
Yeah.
That are like, you know, I was left at preschool as a 2-year-old. I mean, who else cares? I care somehow.
Yeah.
Like, and I just need to resolve that, right? Abandonment. And that manifests in things like, you know, jealousy and guilt and shame and not feeling worthy. And we all have that emotional wound. Specifically, like, there's lots of ways I don't show up, right? I mean, I don't talk as much as I should. I hide away in the background, right? I do things for others because it's a weakness in me that I don't want to have to put myself forward, right? But that means I don't have any skin in the game, which is a weird analogy for a white South African to make, right?
yeah. Very weird.
But I mean, it's like that, you know. It's like we all are like. I mean, I'm not showing up in the way that is empowered all the time.
Yeah.
And like, we all need to get to the place where we feel like we're empowered to say the things, right? And that's our journey, and that comes from, sure, we're all a little bit broken, but like, if you're not working on healing yourself, you're not living, you know.
I love it.
No, I mean, I think for me, movement building is fear of letting anybody down, right? I mean, I was raised by a single mum where I, you know, she lent on me emotionally, and I didn't want to let her down. I wanted to kind of keep the family together, and that's just a manifestation of what I do in my work.
And what we bring into our work, Well, this has just been,
mate,
after all the work you've done over the last like few months, and then specifically concentrated over the last 2 days to bring all this to life, and then just sit down with us and have this conversation, which could pretty much go on for 3 more hours if we wanted, and we're going to get kicked out by the sound check, is just, we're so grateful.
Incredible.
We're so excited to see what more work you do, and you'll be hearing more of Paul, and if not us, then who on this podcast, I have a feeling.
Thank you for joining us this week. We really hope you enjoyed this episode.
If you did, please hit the follow button to make sure you get next week's release.
We are now officially crowdsourcing Climate Confession, so please leave yours in the ratings and the review section, and we'll shout out for you next time. And shout out to our fabulous team behind the pod.
This episode was produced by Josie Coulter, artwork designed by Rebecca Mingus,
curation by Mariam Pasha,
mixed and engineered by Ben Beheshti,
music also by Ben Beheshti,
presented by Ben Hurst
and Mariam Pasha. Remember, stay curious.